Island, Chapter 15. From the side of the hill, which was here steep and stony, a sprout of gravel was dislodged, and my rattling and bounding through the trees. My eyes turned instinctively in that direction, and I saw a figure leap with great rapidity behind the trunk of a pine. What it was, whether man or bear or monkey, I could in no wise tell. It seemed dark and shaggy, more I know not, but the terror of this new apparition brought me to a stand. I was now, it seemed, cut off on both sides, behind me the murderers, before me this lurking nondescript. And immediately I began to prefer the dangers that I knew to those that I knew not. Silver himself appeared less terrible in contrast with this creature of the woods, and I turned on my heel and, looking sharply behind me over my shoulder, began to retrace my steps in the direction of the boats. Instantly the figure reappeared, and making a wide circuit began to head me off. I was tired, at any rate, but I had been as fresh as when I rose. I could see it was in vain for me to contend in speed with such an adversary. From trunk to trunk the creature flitted like a deer, running man-like on two legs, but unlike any man I had ever seen, stooping almost double as it ran. Yet a man it was. I could no longer be in doubt about that. I began to recall what I had heard of cannibals. I was within an ace of calling for help, but the mere fact that he was a man, however wild, had somewhat reassured me, and my fear of Silver began to revive in proportion. I stood still, therefore, and cast about for some method of escape, and as I was so thinking, the recollection of my pistol flashed into my mind. As soon as I remembered I was not defenseless, courage glowed again in my heart, and I set my face resolutely for this man of the island and walked briskly towards him. He was concealed by this time behind another tree trunk, but he must have been watching me closely, for as soon as I began to move in his direction he reappeared and took a step to meet me. Then he hesitated, drew back, came forward again, and at last, to my wonder and confusion, threw himself on his knees and held out clasped hands in supplication. At that I once more stopped. "Who are you?" I asked. "Ben Gunn," he answered, and his voice sounded hoarse and awkward like a rusty lock. "I am poor Ben Gunn, I am. I haven't spoken with a Christian these 3 years." I could now see that he was a white man like myself, and that his features were even pleasing. His skin, wherever it was exposed, was burnt by the sun. Even his lips were black, and his fair eyes looked quite startling in so dark a face. Of all the beggar man that I had seen or fancied, he was the chief for raggedness. He was clothed with tatters of old ship's canvas and old sea cloth, and this extraordinary patchwork was all held together by a system of the most various and incongruous fastenings, brass buttons, bits of stick, and loops of tarry gaskin. About his waist he wore an old brass-bucked leather belt, which was the one thing solid in his whole accoutrement. 3 years, I cried. "Were you shipwrecked?" "Nay, mate," said he, "marooned." I had heard the word, and I knew it stood for a horrible kind of punishment, common enough among the buccaneers, in which the offender is put ashore with a little powder and shot and left behind on some desolate and distant island. "Marooned 3 years ago," he continued, "and lived on goats since then, and berries and oysters. Wherever a man is, says a man can do for himself, but mate, my heart is sore for Christian diet. You mightn't happen to have a piece of cheese about you now, no? Well, many's the long night I've dreamed of cheese, toasted mostly, and woke up again, and here I were. If I can ever get aboard again, said I, you shall have cheese by the stone." All this time he had a feeling of the stuff of my jacket, smoothing my hands, looking at my boots, and generally, in intervals of speech, showing a childish pleasure in the presence of a fellow creature. But at last my words he perked up into a kind of startled shyness. "If ever you can get aboard again, says you," he repeated. "Why now, who's to hinder you?" "Not you, I know," was my reply. "And right you was," he cried. "Now you, what do you call yourself, mate?" "Jim," I told him. Jim, says he, quite pleased, apparently. "Well now, Jim, I've lived that rough as you'd be ashamed of to hear. Now, for instance, you wouldn't think that I had a pious mother to look at me?" he asked. "Why, no, not in particular," I answered. "Ah, well," said he, "but I had, remarkable pious, and I was a civil pious boy, and I could rattle off my catechism that fast, as you couldn't tell one word from another. And here's what it's come to, Jim, and it begun with a chuck farthen on the blessed gravestones. That's what it began with, and it went further in that. And so my mother told me and predicted the whole, she did, the pious woman. But it were Providence that put me here. I've thought it out, all this out in this here lonely island, and I'm back on piety. You don't catch me tasting rum so much, but just a thimbleful for luck, of course. The first chance I have, I'm bound I'll be good, and I'll see the way to do. And Jim, looking all around him and lowering his voice to whisper, I'm rich. I now felt sure that the poor creature had gone crazy in his solitude, and I suppose I must have shown the feeling in my face, for he repeated the statement hotly. Rich, rich, I says. And I'll tell you what, I'll make a man of you, Jim. Ah, Jim, you'll bless your stars, you will. You was the first that found me. And at this there came a sudden lowering shadow over his face, and he tightened his grasp upon my hand and raised a forefinger threateningly before my eyes. Now, Jim, you tell me true. That ain't Flint's ship, he asked. At this I had a happy inspiration. I began to believe that I had found an ally, and I answered him at once. It's not Flint's ship, and Flint is dead. But I'll tell you true, as you ask me, there are some of Flint's hands aboard, and worse the luck for the rest of us. Not a man with one leg, he gasped. Silver, I asked. Ah, Silver, says he, that were his name. He's the cook and the ringleader, too. He was still holding me by the wrist, and at that he gave it quite a ring. If you was sent by Long John, he said, I'm as good as pork, and I know it. But where was you, do you suppose? I had made my mind up in a moment, and by way of an answer I told him the whole story of our voyage, and the predicament in which we found ourselves. He heard me with the keenest interest, and when I had done, he patted me on the head. You're a good lad, Jim, and you're all in a clove hitch, ain't you? Well, you just put your trust in Ben Gunn. Ben Gunn's the man to do it. Would you think it likely now that your squire would provide a liberal-minded one in case of help, being in a clove hitch, as you remark? I told him the squire was the most liberal of men. Ah, but you see, returned Gunn, I didn't mean giving me a gate to keep in a suit of livery clothes and such. That's not my mark, Jim. What I mean is, would he be likely to come down to the tune of, say, £1,000 out of money that's as good as a man's own already? I'm sure he would, said I, and as it was, all hands were to share. And a passage home, he added with a look of great shrewdness. Why, I cried, the squire's a gentleman, and besides, if we get rid of the others, we should want you to help work the vessel home. Ah, he said, so you would. And he seemed very much relieved. Now I'll tell you what, he went on. So much I'll tell you and no more. I were in Flint's ship when he buried the treasure, he and 6 strong seamen. They went ashore nigh on a week, and standing off on the old Walrus. One fine day up went the signal, and here comes Flint by himself in a little boat, and his head done up in a blue scarf. The sun was setting up, in a mortal white he looked upon the cutwater. But there he was, you mind, and 6 all dead and buried. How he done it, not a man aboard could make out. It was a battle, murder, and sudden death, leastwise, him against 6. Billy Bones was his mate, Long John, he was the quartermaster, and they asked him where the treasure was. Ah, says he, you can go ashore if you like and stay, he says. But as for this ship, she'll beat up for more, by thunder, that's what he said. Well, I was in another ship 3 years back, and we sighted this island. Boys, said I, here's Flint's treasure, let's land and find it. The captain was displeased at that, but my messmates were all of a mind and landed. 12 days they looked for it, and every day they had the worst word for me, until one fine morning all hands went aboard. As for you, Benjamin Gunn, says they, here's a musket, they says, and a spade and a pickaxe. You could stay here and find Flint's money all for yourself, they says. Well, Jim, 3 years I've been here, and not a bite of Christian diet from that day to this. But now you look here, look at me. Do I look like a man before the mast? No, says you. Nor I weren't, neither, I says. And with that he winked and pinched me hard. Just you mention them words to your squire, Jim, he went on. Nor he weren't, neither. That's the words. 3 years he were the man of this island, light and dark, fair and rain, and sometimes he would maybe think upon a prayer, says you. And sometimes he would maybe think of his old mother, so be she's alive, you'll say. But the most part of Gunn's time, this is what you'll say, the most part of his time was took up with another matter, and then you'll give him a nip like I do. And he pinched me again in the most confidential manner. Then he continued, then you'll up and you'll say this. Gunn's a good man, you'll say. He puts a precious sight more in confidence, a precious sight, mind that, in a gentleman born than in these gentlemen of fortune, having been one himself. Well, I said, I don't understand one word that you've been saying, but that's neither here nor there, for how am I to get on board? Ah, he said, that's the hitch for sure. Well, there's my boat that I made with my own 2 hands. I keep her here under a white rock. If the worst came to the worst, we might try after dark. Hi, he broke out, what's that? For just then, although the sun had still an hour or 2 to run, all the echoes of the island awoke and bellowed to the thunder of a cannon. They've begun to fight, I cried. Follow me. And I began to run toward the anchorage, my terrors all forgotten, while close at my side the maroon man in his goatskins, trotting easily and lightly. Left, left, says he. Keep to your left hand, mate, Jim. Under the trees with you. There's where I killed my first goat. They don't come down here now. They're all mast-headed on the mountings for the fear of Benjamin Gunn. Here's the cemetery. Cemetery, he must admit. You see that mound? I come here and I prayed nows and thens when I thought maybe a Sunday would be about due. It weren't quite a chapel, but it seemed more solemn-like, and then, says you, Ben Gunn was short-handed. No chapeling, nor so much as a Bible and a flag, you says. So I kept talking as I ran, neither expecting nor receiving any answer. The cannon shot was followed by a considerable interval by a volley of small arms. Another pause, and then, not a quarter mile in front of me, I beheld the Union Jack flutter in the air above a wood. This is the end of chapter 15 and the end of part 3. Wow. 6 parts in the book. This is part 3, which means we're about halfway through. Though this part only had 3 chapters, well, previous parts had more. So we have Ben Gunn, who is on the island and found the treasure, apparently. At least he thinks he did. He's a little confused about a whole bunch of things, so he's not quite sure what day it is, day of the week. But, here he is. He's stranded on the island. He's been doing okay for himself. He wants goats. He wants cheese. And, that's something that's sort of interesting. There are foods that you can eat and you just take it for granted. But then it's like all of a sudden you want it, especially if it's something that you can't have. So, country ham is something that I love. And it's something, that you can only really get in a few places in the country because it's like a Virginia thing. So you get it in Western Virginia. And West Virginia, of course. But you get in Western Virginia, West Virginia, bit in the Carolinas, and it's just one of these foods that it's so good. And there are times where it's like I'm sitting around and it's like I haven't had it in years. And it's just like this craving because it's sort of like a memory of home. And so that's what cheese was for Ben Gunn, because it's like he probably didn't eat all that much cheese to begin with, but here he is living on roots and berries and goat. He's just like, I want cheese, because that's something that he didn't have. If he had the right knowledge, he probably could have had cheese, because goat cheese is totally a thing. But in order to do that, he would have had to have found a female goat and corralled her and sort of kept her fed and happy, and then milked her, and then taken the milk and made cheese. And making cheese isn't exactly an easy process. I've never done it myself. I've seen instructions on how to do it, but it's more than just letting milk sit around and curdle. So he could have made cheese, but he didn't. But he was living fairly well. But he really wanted for companionship. And he knows of Silver. He knows how terrible he is. Jim didn't tell him that Billy Bones is dead as well. But so he's definitely on their side against Silver. So we shall see what happens in the next part. Not even just the next chapter, the next part.